So, I guess a good start would be just to look at the first question out of the list that we've got here. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. So I think one of the biggest challenges here has to be the combination of commercial interests from age verification providers and getting the balance right in terms of the privacy rights of the user. I think at the moment, given the fact that with a lot of sort of data-driven organizations, is that is where their value is, and I suppose the trade-off would be is that they are potentially missing value that they would have ordinarily, or that they currently have, where if we are giving up if the age verification providers are giving up access to how a verification is being used, potentially, in the sense that it would be untrackable, unlinkable, and untraceable, whether that is I suppose it's a case of understanding maybe what people feel about that, whether that is something that is accepted, what kind of concerns that there might be. I don't know what you guys think. I don't know what. This is difficult working in a session, whereas the roundtable is just one in a room.
Hi there, my name's Gilad.
Hey, Gilad, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
You get me off the hook now.
Yeah, no problem. I'll drive for a second or two. I'm an independent privacy and digital identity consultant and researcher, and I have extremely strong opinions about this. This is a political question. It is not. Ultimately, this kind of question gets resolved at the regulatory level, because it cannot be resolved at the commercial level, because the commercial level is conflicted.
Yes.
Ultimately, this is a principles discussion, not the entire workshop, I'm saying, but the question as to the degree of the requirement to do unlinkability, unobservability, and related concepts ultimately must come from regulatory pressure. It cannot come from other sources. Yes, there can be some norms that a commercial business might decide on its own to implement in its architecture, but you basically outlined the problem, which is that the more you put hard privacy preserving architectures into systems, you do close off profit directions and abilities to make more money from a system, as well as create other types of engagement and services that users would like. A great example of this is Signal. Signal is maximally privacy preserving, but it's missing all the stickers and groups and fun stuff that you can do in WhatsApp and others. And it's because the system's encryption architecture is dialed up to 11, and it prevents all kinds of linkability that those other things create. So ultimately, there isn't a good way to sort of gauge the desirability of this. This ends up being a political and regulatory decision. If you look at the way that the CNIL has spelled out their ideal age system, is totally unobservable and unlinkable. It's a triple blind architecture where the attribute provider throws a claim over a wall, and somebody catches it and says, yes, this person is over 18 or over 21, but they don't know who the attribute provider is, the age system, and they don't know who the person is, and that's privacy turned all the way up. That is ultimately a regulatory orientation that the CNIL is taking, which isn't law. That's their ideal. And so, you know, it'll come down to a question of whether or not you want to, because of course the nightmare scenario is people looking at adult content and then being marketed to it based on their adult content preferences. That's the nightmare scenario. You know,
where do you
sorry.
see the trade-off? Like, who
So
do you think, which party do you think is most sort of has the most investment in this? To because I suppose essentially what will happen is somebody is potentially losing out within this scenario because it's different to what the current system is set up to do in some cases.
well, that's actually hard to prove in the sense that, well, it's you have a values discussion there ultimately where you say, do we believe that the affordances of a less privacy preserving system are ultimately valuable enough to allow to exist? In other words, an age, if you can sort of think about this from different scenarios. One scenario is the maximally privacy preserving age assurance system. And in that case, there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't get done. And so then you can sort of put it in those terms, who loses in that equation? But it's a hazy answer. And the hazy answer is, well, people might lose innovative features that they might be interested in, or marketing. There's always that fallback of, oh, they're not going to get marketed to the way that they would inherently like to. And that's I don't buy that. I don't think that's a strong argument. So in terms of, you always have to build you always have to build a system that can cater to the maximum privacy wishes of people within the system. If they want to dial it down, if that's architecturally feasible, then you could give them that opportunity. But ultimately, all defaults, this is me wearing my pro-privacy hat, all defaults should be set to maximum privacy and disallow any sharing of information about the person's use of the age system.
I completely agree. I think I definitely think that's the right approach.
You know, because ultimately, businesses operate on the edges of their regimes, and you know, and we cannot rely on businesses for norms that are this deep in terms of socio-political questions like privacy, because that's how we end up where we currently are, and so there's a precautionary perspective. Again, this is me making an opinion. A super precautionary orientation is needed here because of the incredible danger of people's adult content preferences leaking, as well. And then also in terms of children, I mean, if like on the other side, that's adults legitimately using adult services. On the other side of it is the kids side of it, which is much harder to do from a technical perspective and a data perspective. But so it's like on which side of the line are you in terms of minor versus adult? Because these age systems will operate on both. And so on the adult side, you have this, you know, this sort of primary danger of leaking sensitive information about a person's use of a system. And this is true of an identity system as well. There's no distinction here between the use of a portable digital identity and the use of an age claim. They end up being the same threat issue. And then on the other side of that line, the minor side, then they absolutely have to have no possibility of leaking or collecting additional information.
How far do you think the control of that data needs to go in terms of, say, for example, if you're sending a proof to a relying party, their interrogation of that, do you think it should be more a case of they would ask it a question to confirm a piece of data, or do you think the data should exist within the proof?
I think that's going to end up being an architectural question, in the sense that if you pass an age claim, it's going to inherently have to have provenance with it that indicates that the claim itself is trustable, is legitimate from a legit source. And that legit source has to exist in some, like, that legitimacy is an active technical architectural aspect, right? Like it's on an approved list, or it's cryptographic. No matter what, there's going to have to be some base layer of provenance in relation to the age claim. But you can totally build them where it's just this entity is over 18 and that's all you get. That's totally doable. It's just expensive, and it makes it so that lots of other data is not available. But so sorry, go on.
So I was going to, should that be forced or should it be optional?
Personally, I think forced. That's a personal perspective, because I don't trust the other. I don't trust opening it up.
So my thinking of this is it probably depends on the type of data, right? So for example, asking if somebody is of a certain age is different to asking a passport number, name, images, ID, whatever it would be.
Yeah.
Do you think we need to consider slightly different rules depending on the type of data being required in the proof?
To me, it makes more sense that what we do is we roll it into the use case, and that the use case itself constrains the data that would be sent. And so again, like the CNIL example, is, if you go to an adult content site, then the adult content site is forbidden from being from collecting primary data, and must go to a third party. And then the third party blinds everyone, and essentially just passes an age claim. And so that's, in the CNIL architecture, that's them saying this is what we imagine an ideal age system looks like. And so it just blinds everyone. But ultimately, that would have to be within particular use cases. And the use cases might just be broad, like, adult content. Like you might just say, in the context of adult content, thou shalt only pass age claims with no identifying data. When you move to another context like gambling, then you can't do that. Gambling has its own AML requirements, etc. So I think that you could probably have a couple of big, broad categories. You might be able to say porn as separate from adult or restricted content. You would probably be able to say gaming, not gambling, but sort of Roblox type gaming. And then you've got gambling. And then liquor purchases and things like restricted goods. So you can probably come up with a good, half dozen set of categories to get you started, to wonder about how much do you lock down ancillary information.
And with regards to how this question one has been defined in terms of untrackability, unlinkability, and untraceability, do you think there's any other areas that we need to consider?
Firstly, let me just say I'm very sensitive that I am hogging up a lot of the air in the room taking this, and so I definitely want to say that I'm gonna shut up and other people should jump in. But on this one point, I want to say that I don't like the terms untraceability and untrackability. I like the term unlinkability. I like the term unobservability, because that's much more precise. Yep. There is a lexicon that was produced about 15 years ago for the identity management industry, or identity management technologies, that is a lexicon that basically starts in English and German and then translates those terms into like 6 other languages. I think that that's a great starting place, and I can send a link to that lexicon, because those are, I feel that nearly all discussions about age assurance should be rooted in the language of identity management, because there's 25 years of it already there. It's extremely well established. It's very well established technologically. It's very well established in the commercial spaces and in the standard spaces. And so I think that at every turn, we should be aligning age discussions with existing identity management and identity access management language.
But Martin, what are your thoughts on this? I just noticed you put a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Now I was wondering also, like when you were mentioning about having this this externality of sharing information, like that would just be an age proof, not revealing any further information. I know that, for example, in the European context, they try to have attributes linked to electronic identities. But like the claim is that you would be basically able to just reveal your age without further information. but I'm a bit dubitative whether there is still a full 100% untrackability or unobservability, depending on the lexicon that we follow. Because like I'm a lawyer, I'm not a technologist, but if I look about the within the EIDAS regulation, they basically says that when a service providers want to access the proof of age, they have to, there is an authentication that is used to make sure that the provider of the electronic identity is the holder of this electronic identity attributes, which would also be a way to prevent that someone else is using this identity. I don't know if there is certain, like if there are people here in the room that have specific knowledge, like more technical knowledge that I do on those, and that can provide insight of how that would work, whether this authentication equals traceability, and whether that prevents it to be privacy friendly.
That's high. I was just going to say that's highlighting a very significant and very live issue right now in the EIDAS architecture privacy considerations. That is really, you know, the degree of linkability is completely specific to a given system. And so in which case, you know, what if we're talking about kind of the EIDAS reference architecture, that the privacy dimensions of that are very much a ball in play. There are issues around that. And so, but that's just one implementation, because you can look at more traditional federated identity systems and you can do this. It is very possible. I mean, there's a distinction between sort of building something, you know, to deal with certain threats, and then, you know, the threat actors, you know, breaking systems. But it is very much technically feasible to build blind age claims, depending on the system. It, like, you know, it may or may not. Like if you look at the German EID system, the German EID system is unobservable and unlinkable through a bit of a contortion, and it can, in given the correct certificates, it can pass over 18 claims that are cryptographically valid. The question of, you know, whether the person is who they claim to be in that is a perpetual problem with an identity, and so that's something that has to be defeated. But from a cryptographic perspective, it is totally possible to do this.
Can I ask, are we all pro privacy in this little group?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know whether there was anybody representing sort of an age verification provider who may have a slightly different take.
I mean, I guess I was just going to say, I guess the age verification providers, they would claim to be pro-privacy, likely anyway. And I think what Gilad just said was quite interesting, that technical feasibility doesn't seem to be the problem. The problem, to my mind, is trust. If this is technically feasible, how can we trust that this is actually what's taking place? I know that some age assurance providers have been in conversation with CNIL, and they've been saying, well, look, this is how our technology works anyway. We have a double-blind approach, and CNIL sometimes have disagreed with that, and there's been a bit of back and forth. So this is a question to anyone in the group, I suppose. What pragmatic steps can be taken to build trust that if we have these proposed technical architectures, which we think are technically feasible and do provide a good amount of privacy, what are the steps that need to be taken to build trust that the technology is actually working as it claims to be working?
Third-party evaluation. It's really the only method. So
who's the third party?
Oh, well, just like we have like a T-scheme type of organization, or basically accredited secure, like just like you would do security auditing of something like pen testing and red teaming, you would do the same thing with this kind of thing.
And I guess the issue then is, do those exist now? Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Those, yes, what you're talking about are experts in the cryptographic architectures of identity systems, and there's tons of them. Not tons, there's a bunch, to be more imprecise.
Shall I read out the...
Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just for my understanding, Glid, are you trying to propose that, a third party here is again, we are handing over our data to some other person who will again be auditing, and will there not be again a question of safety here?
No, a third party would be running, a third party entity in this case would be testing the architecture. They're not looking for the personal data of a live production system. They would be looking to bang on a system before it goes into production. I mean, you could run it when it was in production, but you wouldn't be doing it in such a way that you would be getting personal data. You would be doing, this is the equivalent of, you've built a new car engine and you want to make sure it does all the things it's supposed to do. So you test the engine before it's put in a car.
Yeah.
How do you think, sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, so like age verification companies, how do they approach? As in, like, do you think, again, I might be repeating the question, but do we have any such third parties are available to validate a particular company, saying that, yeah, you can trust them, they are implementing proper PET technologies, and you can just go ahead and give your data and they will be verifying your age, or whatever concerns that we're going for?
My view is that those companies exist, and that you have sort of entities on the more accredited side of the universe that have a bit more sort of public legitimacy, in the sense that they've gotten blessings from various bodies above them. But you can also go to private entities and do that. There are basically expert companies, and they put their reputations on the line for the testing of these systems. So there's a spectrum of the nature of the third party testers that are out there, that are some that are much more sort of public and transparent in that, sort of like ACCS is testing age systems for conformity. This is a security audit. And just like you have to do security audits against other high value systems, this would be another high value system that would be audited. And the degree of the private versus public nature of the auditor is variable.
Okay.
There's a comment in the chat which we could touch on briefly. I don't know if you want to come in, Ijeoma, but I am pro-privacy, but not privacy of child from parent. Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So when I say pro-privacy, yes, but I observe that there are some big tech policies which move the child away from the parents' purview when they get to age 13 or 16. And what that essentially means is the child has a right to privacy, but do they have privacy away from the parents, so that parental monitoring is completely removed?
It's a political decision. Those things become political decisions. Like those types of, in other words, the age of consent in Europe is established through the GDPR, and then each individual member state can then theoretically raise that number up to from 13 to 16. And so then it becomes a national decision. That's in relation to consent, to be able to consent for a service. But, more broadly, for example, in certain countries, children can go have sexual health services that they don't have to ask their parents for permission, and the medical office doesn't have to give that information out. And that's not a technical system, but it's, in this case, it's just an example of, these are ultimately political questions, like the degree of privacy granted, but when a child interacts with a system, and whether the parent needs to be informed or is actively informed, those things end up being political decisions.
Yeah, I completely agree. We had quite an interesting chat in this room just before this one about consent. and transparency and touched on a lot of this, and it ultimately comes down to quite live political debates which are happening around the world at the moment, and can be difficult to find consensus on. I'm hogging the mic. Are you moderating this session?
So how do we influence
you know.
that in standard setting now? What do we do to influence that? Because yes, it's a political decision, but politics will say what it does. It will say what it says. When it gets down to implementation or individual experiences, you find that politics, invariably overlooked something. They overlooked a situation that, they didn't foresee. So if politics says 13 is the age of privacy, and privacy means privacy away from parent, what happens when a 15, 16, 17-year-old who is a minor legally then comes into a negative experience because parental consent was removed in favor of preserving the child's privacy?
Yeah, I suppose here it comes down to questions about the evolving capacities of, oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm done. Sorry. I'm done.
Okay, sorry, we didn't hear you that well in the room. But I suppose it comes down to questions on the evolving capacities of the child, and ideally, I think human beings, including children, should have as many freedoms, as many rights afforded to them as is reasonable given their stage of development. And I think it's probably right that we increase a child's ability to exercise control over their own rights as they get older. Obviously, when you're talking about regulation, legislation, etc., you have to use clunky tools like age thresholds, which are imperfect, and GDPR, as Gilad says, enables states to set that age at different points according to the, I guess, proclivities of that particular state. But yeah, I feel like we're moving away from the untrackability issue potentially.
Well, it's a trade-off, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's. I was just gonna say, with regards to specifically dealing with children, is that there possibly needs to be two different approaches, because depending on where you are in the world, children's rights vary. So whether we have a standard that applies to all children globally, or whether we have a standard that is adaptable to deal with the fact that children may have different levels of rights, or for example, parents might have different levels of rights over children in different countries. I don't know whether having a blanket approach to privacy when it comes to children is necessarily maybe the safest approach. I'm not sure.
I mean, these are standards. And while admittedly, standards are political instruments, this is, the standard can't solve these types of problems. Although there is one practical, I think, consideration to take from this discussion, which is, how does the concept of verified parental consent intersect the standard? Because, we are talking about the technical standard of passing age claims, and birth dates and various things. And one of the other regulatory elements within this is the concept of verified parental consent, which essentially is well baked into the COPPA standard. And then we start to see it migrating over to Europe. And so and that's a kind of good, well-established term now around it. And you have companies out there like Super Awesome that was acquired, I think, by Epic. And their bread and butter was verified parental consent architectures and systems. And so it's interesting to sort of wonder about, because the verified parental consent concept is growing on a slightly different path than some of these age systems that we're talking about, because the point of the verified parental consent is to pass consent and anchor it to a parent of a known child, that the relationship between parent and child is trustable, and that the consent is trustable. This is not an age assurance in the traditional sense, but it clearly has direct overlap. And so it seems to me that there is at least a sub working group question to wonder about where do the VPC technologies and markets intersect the development of this standard.
I just like, I mean, I think it's an incredibly complex thing to do when it comes to children, because often there's just not the data necessarily available that is accurate for identifying a guardian of a child, whether that be a parent or what have you. I think,
but there are full commercial businesses doing that. I mean, because of the COPPA standard.
Yeah, I think I don't know whether it's probably different in the EU and UK. So when in the implementation of that in the US, how is that relied upon?
Because they're doing an identity touch on the parent, and then they're doing a bit of a dance around phone ownership, the originating email of the child, then getting related to, linked up to the email of the parent. I don't remember all the specifics of a like Super Awesome's implementation, but essentially, it's trying to solve one of the
it's a different
major problems in identity management, which we've talked about earlier, which is also about how do you connect the, if a person's making an age claim, I am 16, and it's basically a 9-year-old giving their phone to their 16-year-old sibling to then do the face biometric. This is a credential binding problem, which is a problem throughout all of identity management and attribute management. And so there are different ways to sort of handle it, and and different anchor points like phones, email addresses. In the case of adults touching adult data, but not touching the kid data, because we never want to stockpile kid data. That's basically thankfully, we don't have big stockpiles of kid data, identity data, and we shouldn't have big stockpiles of kid identity data. So there will always be a problem in terms of deterministic information about a child that you can rely on, and that includes information about the child's relationship with the parent. So it's basically, it'll be an industry of workarounds to get around the fact that we thankfully don't have huge stockpiles of child data. But ultimately, these things happen. The VPC standard's been in place for years. It's a good idea. So there has to be a sort of technical linkage, I think, with the work we're doing here.
In terms of seeing the parent-child relationship in terms of what gets produced in a proof, do you think there is an argument for linkability between the parent and the child with regards to this? Do you think that the definition used in this for linkability, do you think that applies, unlinkability, do you think that applies to that combination?
Yes, I think it does. I think you're right. I think that ultimately from Ijioma's perspective, the idea of sort of that there has to be affordances for local choices about reducing how much privacy a child has in relation to parental oversight, then you must introduce linkability, such at least that the parent can audit or authorize or look over their shoulder or know what the child is doing. And you need to do it, like these are really naughty problems. And so, the ideals are, we want a system that has variable privacy in this regard. Like, do you get an alert every time the child goes to a new website, or are you just cool with them in general? And in fact, the Super Awesome system creates a profile where each time they ask for access to a new restricted website, then the parent gets a notification on their phone and they can say yes or no.
So under those circumstances, then it requires trackability and traceability for one of,
while in my world, hopefully blinding the plumbing, blinding the service provider.
Yes.
Yes, that's exactly what I was saying. You said blind the plumbing. We're not trying to track the child. We're not making the child available for general tracking space. And it's not even so much tracking by the parent, but linkability. So, whatever the child's activity is, the parent to be linked into that. And for the parents to be the ones to give the consent where the website or the activity is beyond the child's scope.
Yeah, and it's crucial and a complex system to build. Yeah, it's why you don't see a ton of these out there, because it's hard, but it's as you point out, it's critical.
It is hard, and those are the hard issues I think we should be talking about. Otherwise, big techs, DSPs, they'll build whatever they want to build. But if we don't set the standards right here, then if we don't do the difficult work here and open those conversations, then we'll just have all sorts of things going on all over the world. And with the big techs making the decisions on what.
So I'm just thinking that actually with some of the items in these questions maybe are not something for consideration here. So for example, implementing solutions at scale, that's not really relevant, is it? What we're talking about more is the principle of privacy that can be applied in any number of different ways. It doesn't matter. The solutions at scale shouldn't be a limiting factor.
Yes, but ultimately, somebody's got to make a buck.
Yes.
And the scale is a major dimension of that. Identity management as a field is full of great ideas that are dead on the side of the road because people couldn't make a buck, or they couldn't make a buck fast enough, or the investment cycles and the time it actually takes to develop these systems are out of sync. So doing it at scale, at least in at a gross level, is an important consideration, because I mean, if you're a government and you're requiring this kind of stuff, you have equity concerns. If you're an investor and you want to fund a company to do this at internet scale and get them to be huge, you've got profit concerns. Mm-hmm. And so that scale ends up being a very significant issue in terms of the feasibility of running this as a business.
So in terms of the fact that there needs to be a technical solution, with the way that it mostly works in the UK at the minute, is generally you have a verification provider who has a contract with a relying party. Now, if you're introducing another element to that process, where is that funded? Where is that? How is that paid for? Is that from the issuer? Is it something that the relying party has a contract with? Is it done as effectively the issuer will become a third party for a service like the one that you described, which I can't remember the name of? How should that impact the considerations?
Forgive me, I don't fully follow. What's the third party being introduced?
Sorry, so you were saying that there's a company bought by Epic that were doing
verified parental consent
control. Yeah,
super awesome.
Thank you. So are they doing a verification themselves, or are they using a third party to provide a verification service?
All identity providers and all age providers have to reach out to third parties. Mm-hmm. They're reaching out for deterministic identity data sources. In the UK, you've got electoral rolls, you've got DVLA, but you've also got all the data brokers and Experian and Equifax and a million other different providers. Ultimately, because there's a coverage question, how good your coverage is in the UK is not equivalent to how good your coverage is in Bulgaria, is not equivalent to how your coverage is in South Africa. And so they ultimately, all of these providers are reaching out to third parties as subcontractors to them as part of the process. So that's already, so from a that's a data sourcing perspective. They're sourcing different data.
So the challenge then is the cost of the system, isn't it? And whether that
always.
The only way to maintain that is through legislation then, isn't it? Because the people are not going to choose to use a more expensive system because they're going to be looking to minimize the cost of the checks that they're putting in place.
And that's the economics of privacy. The economics of privacy is that more privacy generally means more cost, and privacy is not a revenue center, it's a cost center.
Yes.
So it's legislation. It's actually legislation plus rigorous enforcement action, isn't it? Because otherwise, most companies will probably think, okay, well, we're not being perfect, but it's still probably going to be more cost effective for us to not care that much about this and hope we don't get fined, or just the fines won't be that significant. Or if an investigation gets launched into us, we might do something later down the line.
So it needs to be combined with an enforcement.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is fundamentally the economics of regulation writ large.
Yeah.
You know, remember Volkswagen building actual physical chips into cars to fool regulators? You know, so it's, yeah, and this is true of, you can think of this, you know, privacy and data protection. It's like, oh, well, you know, what are the chances we're going to get caught? That is a very real calculus.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the case of age, there is a think of the children moral panic dimension to it that might make companies a bit more wary. It's age tends to be closer to lightning rod stuff like porn. So it may just sort of add a little bit of extra conformity just out of the fears that are surrounded, the sensitivities around it. But more broadly, in general, all regulatory efforts need strong oversight, or, you know, people won't do the thing.
How long do we have? 8 minutes. Should we pick one of these questions to dig into then? Or...
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
At random.
Sure. You've kind of touched on that one. This one's interesting. So how can age verification systems ensure compliance with privacy regulations such as GDPR, CCPA, COPPA, and others, while simultaneously upholding principles of untrackability, unlinkability, and untraceability? And what strategies can be adopted to navigate potential conflicts between regulatory requirements and privacy objectives? So, I mean, I guess the answer there is, in theory, where you need greater privacy afforded to children, or where you need to afford children with greater protections, age assurance of some sort can facilitate that. But then, of course, you need the age verification systems themselves to be complying with these regulations. So that's potentially a bit of a catch-22. Although we've already been over this, really, I think.
And also, I believe the conflict always comes between should we hold the data or should we not? As in, like, for age verification company, there are certain regulations, especially in terms of gambling or gaming industry, where they need to hold the customers or the client's data. But again, we do have some regulations when we talk about the data privacy is important, and we should not be holding customer data for, say, for some period of time. I always find that's a conflict, or how should we direct towards that?
Yeah, that tends to be sectoral. But here we have opportunity. Again, the CNIL is a great example. They don't want they don't want first parties to ever get the data. And so that's a political and principle-based choice. You see, and so of course, in regulated industries, more differently regulated industries, they need to hold birth date as KYC information. But we have opportunity here to actually build in the privacy norms to age-specific legislation. So there's a few types of regulation these days that deal with age. There's 4 types. One is online safety regulation, like you see the kind in the UK and in Australia. One is specifically anti-kids looking at porn, which you see in the United States. It's at the state level. One is social media regulation, which you're seeing also in the United States, where they're saying, like, you know, curfews and parental requirements and age restrictions and whatnot. And then the other, and there's a 5th type actually, and there's the other is another is the age appropriate design code laws, which are a bit more aspirational. And then you have something like the Digital Services Act, which is platform regulation, but that requires user segmentation. So all of these laws, or they overlap, and they're all, you know, but they all touch on similar stuff and some different stuff, but they're all mentioning age. And those laws are the better place to anchor age-oriented privacy requirements than to turn to the GDPR, which is really lightweight on kid stuff.
Yeah, that's so. I used to work at Ofcom until about 3 months ago when I left to set up my own business. But one of the challenges there is that where you have, in the UK at least, you have an online safety regulator, and the Online Safety Act actually covers the kind of stop kids looking at porn bit in Part 5, as well as the social media regulation bit, albeit in a very different way to the laws being passed in the US, I think. But we also obviously have the Information Commissioner's Office for data protection, and there's quite a lot of emphasis placed on ensuring that the remit of each of those regulators is kept distinct. And the idea behind that is to avoid confusing different stakeholders about who's responsible for what. But at the same time, obviously, online harms often originate from nefarious data protection practices or irresponsible data processing. So I suppose that's just another challenge for regulators to overcome, is how can, well, this might be quite UK specific, I'm not sure, but how can online safety regulation and data protection regulation, and privacy goes beyond data protection, of course, but how can they collaborate together more efficiently? I think we might be out of time though. Yeah. Okay. 2 minutes. Okay. Do we have any closing comments then from online or thoughts? Awesome. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the participation, Zoom and in person. I think it was a very informative session. Yeah.